Hey, what's going on everybody? It's ETA Prime back here again. Today we're going to be taking a look at an awesome little affordable PC that I recently picked up, known as the Aerofara 2 Pro. So we've been taking a look at some inexpensive mini PCs on the channel recently, and when it comes down to it, I love the more powerful Ryzen ones, but those are, $600 to $1,100. This was recently on sale over on Amazon for $180, and I couldn't pass it up. I took a look at the specs and the form factor here, and I think it's going to make a great little desktop / media player / emulation setup. I've actually tested the same chip that's in this and another mini PC recently, but this is actually coming in a lot cheaper with the same specs. So inside of the box, you're obviously going to get the mini PC. They've also included a 6-foot HDMI cable and a 24-watt 12-volt power supply. Taking a look at the front of the unit, there is a hidden LED here that lights up when everything's up and running. Over on the right-hand side, they have included VGA, which is a little odd, but I guess it would come in handy for an older monitor. On the right-hand side, we have a full-size SD card slot, 2 USB 3.0 ports, and our power button. Round back, we've got our power input, another USB 3.0 port, full-size HDMI, gigabit Ethernet, and we've also got our audio input, a 3.5mm audio jack, plus our BIOS reset button. Taking a look at the specs for the CPU, we get the Intel Celeron N5105. This is definitely an upgrade over the N5095. We get 4 cores, base clock of 2 GHz with a turbo up to 2.9, and all 4 cores will run at 2.8. When it comes to the GPU, this does have the upgraded Celeron GPU with 24 execution units up to 800 MHz. This has 8 GB of non-user replaceable LPDDR4 RAM soldered to the board. It's running at 2,933 MHz and it is in dual channel, so it does help out with GPU performance. The one that I opted for came with a 128 GB M.2 SSD. This is user replaceable. You can go up to 1 TB in this unit. It's got built-in AC Wi-Fi, Bluetooth 4.2, and it runs Windows 10 out of the box, but I've actually upgraded mine to Windows 11. And real quick, before we get into testing, I wanted to give you a look at the internals here. It's actually really easy to get apart. There are 7 screws on the bottom you need to remove, and then we can slide this whole board right out. It's actively cooled, so this thing's not going to overheat, and it pulls a maximum of 18 watts from the wall. It's a really low-powered unit. We've got that user replaceable M.2 SSD, and really, that's about it. That's the only upgrades we can do to this, given that the RAM is soldered to the board. So in this video, I wanted to take a look at the Windows performance. We're going to test some 4K video playback, test out some native PC games. We'll move over to some emulation in Windows, and we're also going to run an operating system called Batocera from a USB drive. Because right now, with the prices of the Raspberry Pi 4, I think this would be a great option for a little emulation setup if you wanted to spend just a bit more money than an 8GB Raspberry Pi and get a lot more performance out of it. Okay, so here it is. Got everything set up. I actually upgraded to Windows 11. It did come with Windows 10 pre-installed, but it gave me the option. Even though this thing is actively cooled, you can't hear the fan unless you put your ear right up to it. This thing's running at about 15 watts, and even at full boat, that fan is basically inaudible from about a foot away. As you can see, we have that Intel Celeron 5105 CPU, 8 GB of RAM, and this is running at 2,933 MHz in dual channel. That was something I was worried about. And the built-in Intel UHD graphics with 24 execution units. When it comes to web browsing, very snappy. It doesn't have Wi-Fi 6 built in, but it does have AC Wi-Fi. Very snappy little experience, checking emails, web browsing, some video playback, which we'll take a look at some 4K video playback in just a second. But overall, as a little web browsing machine, you can't go wrong with this little chip. It does work out quite well for things like that. So whenever I test out 4K video playback on these little mini PCs, I always like to turn scaling completely off with Windows. That way we have a full 4K viewpoint, and this is a 4K 60 FPS video. I will have stats for nerds up in the top left hand corner. I'll zoom in a bit after we get to about 6,000 frames, but I want to show you how well this does run 4K video. Overall, I've been really impressed with this little chip. The new Jasper Lake Celeron CPUs are actually really good. Low power consumption, we've got great 4K video playback, but they do make a couple different variants. The N5105, which we have here, has that higher end GPU built in with 24 execution units. Same thing with the N6000, but if you pick up the N5095, it only has 16, and this does make a huge difference. So as you can see, our viewpoint is at 4K. Our current resolution is at 4K. We're running this at 60 FPS. And so far, we've only got 11 drop frames. This isn't bad at all, and you'd never notice those drop frames unless you had a frame counter on like we do right now. Next thing I did was run a few benchmarks. First up, we have Geekbench 5, single core, 618, multi, 2015. Not the highest scores on the planet, but these are actually really good for this 10-watt chip we're working with here. Next up, I went with 3D Mark Wildlife. This is a Vulkan benchmark for the built-in GPU. Total score, 2,537. And finally, 3D Mark Night Raid with a 3,860. So overall, for an everyday desktop, they're really not that impressive. But when you factor in how small this is and the wattage is pulling from the wall, they're not bad at all. Now it's time to move over to some PC gaming, and then we'll move into some emulation. So I went with some lower end games just to see what it could do. First up, we have Battletoads, 720p, low settings. I thought we'd definitely have a constant 60 here. With VSync on, it's definitely playable. I really wouldn't even notice it if that frame counter wasn't on. I could play through this on the mini PC, but I was really hoping for a constant 60 out of this one. Next on the list, we have the original Skyrim, 720p, low settings, and this does run at 60, as you can see. Up in the top left-hand corner, I do have Afterburner running, and with this built-in fan, like I mentioned at the beginning, you're not hearing it at all, and it definitely keeps the CPU nice and chilly. I never hit thermal throttle. Actually, we never even hit 68 degrees Celsius with this unit. And finally, for the PC gaming side of things, the Art of Rally 720p low settings, I got an average of 68 FPS out of this, and in most cases it is much higher, but when there's a lot of trees on screen, you will see it dip down a little bit. Now it's time to move over to some emulation, and here we have Gamecube using the Dolphin emulator, Vulkan back-in, native resolution. It runs Gamecube really well. Even some of the harder to emulate stuff like Automodelista will play at 60 FPS, but you're still going to run into a few games like F-Zero that just won't do full speed on this little setup. Since I was right there with the Dolphin emulator, I figured we'd throw a Wii game in here. Vulkan back in, native resolution, Tatsunoko versus Capcom, again, we're at 60. I'm actually really impressed by the Gamecube and Wii performance out of this little chip here. It actually works really, really well. Now it's time to take it up a notch to PS2 using PPSSPP. We're at the native resolution DirectX 11 backend, and in my experience, this does require a little more CPU power than the Dolphin emulator to get these games running at full speed. Now there are games that are going to work with the PPSSPP emulator on this box, but don't expect to run every PS2 game at full speed. One that I always like to test is Gran Turismo 4, and unfortunately, it just wasn't quite hanging at 60. We did have some major dips, and initially going into this I got really excited, but as soon as I started turning some of these corners and we had that longer draw distance, you can see it dip down into the 40s. Really unfortunate, but I kind of expected this. We're only at 2.8 to 2.9 gigahertz on this CPU. So emulation on this in Windows is actually really great. It'll do PSP, it'll do Dreamcast, N64. As you saw, we've got GameCube, we've got some PS2 games, but I did want to test out a standalone emulation front end known as Batocera. A lot of my regular viewers might know about this. It's running from a USB drive right now, and I've just installed a couple games in here to test out, but everything works. We've got Ethernet, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, HDMI, sound over HDMI. There was nothing that I had to change in here. I just flashed it to a USB drive, added a couple extra games, and booted it up. So here from the information, you can see we have that N5105 running on this little PC, and emulation is actually really great. Again, we saw PS2, it will run some PS2 games, but in Windows, we will get better performance due to that DirectX 11 backend we can use. And as soon as Batocera adds kind of the development version of PPSSPP with Vulkan support, We will start seeing better performance with PS2 and Batocera with this little mini PC, but right now it definitely has PSP covered. With Tekken 6 Hero, it's actually able to take this up to 4x resolution using that Vulkan backend, and if you wanted to do the harder to run games like Chains of Olympus, you will have to drop it down to 2x, but it still looks great and it runs at full speed. Let's move over to Dreamcast real quick. And I just went with Marvel vs. Capcom 2. We're using the Flycast core inside of RetroArch. This little PC has more than enough power to emulate Dreamcast, whether you want to use Redream, which in my opinion would work out better, especially in Windows, or Flycast, which we have running here. So I mean, we definitely have multiple operating system options for this, and if you wanted to turn it into a little emulation console that's way more powerful than the Raspberry Pi, it's really easy to do. Overall, really enjoying this little PC, and you'll find a ton of these new Celeron CPUs, the 5105, and a lot of mini PCs on Amazon and eBay nowadays. One thing you really need to look for is make sure it's running dual channel RAM. That's really going to help out with the GPU. And I would stay away from the mini PCs that are using the N5105. It's just not as powerful as this one, at least on the GPU side of things. CPU performance is right on par, but if you want to do any gaming or emulation, you definitely want those extra execution units. With the price of the Raspberry Pi nowadays for retro gaming, this actually might be a good option. We do have more power than the Raspberry Pi 4, and right now if you were to go out and buy an 8GB Raspberry Pi, a decently sized micro SD card, power supply, and a mini HDMI cable, this is only going to come in around $30 more, and it's definitely worth that extra performance. You can run Windows 10, Windows 11, basically any variant of Linux as long as it supports an x86 CPU. And we also have something like Batocera or RetroPie x86, so you can turn this into a really nice little retro gaming setup. So yeah, I think it performs really well, and if you're interested in learning more, maybe picking one of these up, I will leave a few links in the description. If there's anything else you want to see running on this, just let me know what it is in the comments below. Like always, thanks for watching.